Hit it, Abby.
Okay, Tom gave you a little bit of my background, and I'm a nurse. I have my RN, but I went back to school, and I have a degree in sociology and social work. I went a different route, and I have my master's in public health. So one of the things that I've done is, as we said at dinner, is I've done some big events and I've done some presentations. But when Tom asked me to be part of his board, Veteran Angels board, I was really honored. But I thought I was there for ideas, support, and registration. And then he emailed me this week and said, "You're speaking." And so I sort of panicked, and I thought, I'm not a military veteran. I'm not. The closest was my uncle, who was a captain in the Marines and fought in the Pacific during World War II and never talked about it. And he made a career of it. But he retired in the 60s, but he never talked about it. So that was the closest growing up that I was to military. You know, my husband was in the National Guard, but he was never deployed. So I'm thinking, how am I going to inspire you when I have done nothing to parallel your life's experiences? And so I kind of panicked on that, and so what I do, I'm a statistics person, so I looked up the statistics for the Iraq and Afghanistan war. And 1 in 5 veterans have PTSD, and 20% of the suicides in the country are veterans. And so when I looked at that, I thought the people in this room are going to be survivors. And so I looked up the definition of a survivor, and it says one who suffers the effects and continues to exist. And I thought, what a shallow definition, because I find survivors have incredible depth. And when you look at what a survivor is, and I prefer to look at a survivor is one who seizes the opportunity of the moment and is not trying to find life or understand it, but rather forces it to have meaning, especially when you're still in battle, because you're surviving and maybe some of your other people in your troop are not. And so it's almost like an automatic thing when you survive in battle. Then you return home, and you try to understand what it is like being a survivor. So the more we persist to understand something and the phenomenon of life, the more you cannot alter the reality of your experiences. You can't alter it, it happened. And so it is very difficult to let go of the traumatic past because it's part of us. And part of you have been lost on that battlefield. What we tend to forget is that we have to come to terms with our loss. What is that loss? It's the loss of who you were. So you have to come to terms with it, and we have to have the courage to grieve what is lost. And you're probably thinking, lady, you have no idea what courage is. I believe that you have to have the courage to grieve. And when you grieve, I firmly believe that God walks beside you. He is there for you, but you have to believe He is there. Now I want to take the time to read a poem entitled "The Battle." It was written by a 16-year-old, 15-year-old. The battle is over, it is lost. The war continues until death, but how soon is that? My body a battered guinea pig. I have the scars of a seasoned veteran. My mind is there, has the anguish gutted it. I look at myself, but who am I? I know who I was. I was loving and loved. I was compassionate and gentle. I had a temper, but even in wrath, I showed a want of love. I look at my hands and see a different life. one scarred. What did this scar do to me? It destroyed all outer beauty. I had to go beneath the surface to find myself. I sometimes see myself as fake, but as those scars of war, they just don't go away. I have to learn how to be me again. How do I relate to others? They have battles of their own, but where are their scars? So when I read this poem, I often think of my grandmother. I had this little Italian grandmother who survived many things in life, including one where she was deaf, probably in her young 20s or 30s. But she had hearing aids that I thought were prehistoric. They had wires, and she had a battery. She never gave up. And when she talked on the phone, it was like this, and I just loved to watch her talk because, let me think about this. She heard this, but she talked here. So she never had a phone up here. And it always amazed me how she adapted to life. But growing up Italian with her was extremely one of my best moments, and I consider it life's treasure. She was a feisty little Italian. We called her Little Nonno. The other woman, my other grandmother, was very tall, but this was Little Nonno. And she had a quick wit and a sharp tongue. Something like I do. 4th grade education, but her wisdom far exceeded anyone with the highest education. She loved her garden. And I remember her hotbeds and going down, and she would lift it up, and you'd smell basil and oregano and parsley, and it was just a wonderful aroma. She had beautiful flower gardens. And the one day when I went to visit, it was early spring, and we went outside to look at the daffodils. And I saw the daffodils on the ground in the snow. And so as a child, very emotional Italian, I was tearing up. And in her infinite wisdom, she said to me, the daffodils were bent in the snow and resting on the ground, but she said, sometimes the weakest are the hardiest. And they only bend, they don't break. Wow. And they will come back up. And so I never forgot that. And that day came to mind when, as a 29-year-old mother, I walked into her house to tell her daughter, her youngest daughter, had died of cancer. She was devastated, but through her tears, she really said, Rosalind's with God. And I still remember her with the rosaries in her hand, and even though she was devastated, she believed in God. After that day, and it's funny because we had a very special connection, that after that day, she'd call me every morning at 7 a.m. and said, well, I made it through the night. And I said, I can hear you did, and would plan her whole day. Whether it was sewing or in the garden or whatever, she and I planned her whole day. And I never forgot the courage and dignity that she had over the losses in her life. But I would go down there and visit, and she would oftentimes have roses for me, and she'd just press them in my hand, and I could see by those eyes that she was saying to me, take the time to enjoy the beauty of life. Take the time to do that. Because time was marching on for her, and she lost her daughter. She had a lot of losses in life. Years after Nana passed, I became a survivor. The poem I read earlier was written by my son, Tim. He was one of 4 sons, but I lost my soulmate when I lost Tim. Tim was my soulmate. And even though it did mean that I loved my other sons less, that there's always somebody that's your soulmate. He loved to write poetry. Didn't mean that he was less of a man. When he couldn't, he ran track and he played football, but he also took ballet. We could sit and discuss anything. So he had a 2-year battle, and the last 2 months were at Johns Hopkins. And every morning when I got up, I would meditate. And I would meditate out loud in my room. Why not? And I'd talk to God. And I'd end every prayer with, "Dear God, make me a daffodil."
Wow.
Now, somebody heard me, and I walked out of that room, and they thought I was nuts. And I thought, you know what? You didn't grow up Italian. You don't understand hotbeds, making sauce from tomatoes, and daffodils. So I just would go off to Johns Hopkins in the bus. But I said that all the time, "Dear God, make me a daffodil." So after Tim died, I remembered nothing but despair. And maybe God didn't heal me because I'm still laying on the ground. You know, I haven't risen up like that daffodil. So I'm thinking, has he not heard me? And I'm having some really bad days. And the principal of Greensburg Central Catholic called me. It's where Tim went to school. And he said, "The students are having a difficult time with Tim's illness and death. Can you come to a day of recollection and talk?" And I said yes. And I felt the same way then that I did when Tom emailed me this week. What the hell am I going to talk about? You know, what am I going to say to these kids? But we came together, and barely 2 months had passed since Tim died. He died the 4th of July. This was in September. So we agreed, and I agreed, and we shared stories. And Tim ran track, played football, and he was in speech and debate, which he was very good in. And he ended up having a lot of awards from speech and debate. So he's very special in his class, and those classmates were special to him. But that day we shared stories together. We learned to talk, and that it was okay to talk about the crazy things they did together, even with his mother. It was okay to cry and laugh, and it was okay to go on living without Tim. I almost had to give them permission to go on living. We had a day of sharing and caring and praying. We always prayed at those retreats. When we were departed, we were proud of where we had been with Tim and far less afraid of how we would live without him. It was my turning point where I found the courage to start grieving. I was never angry in the sense that this happened to me. I was angry at me. I was an oncology nurse. And how could I do that and lose a son to cancer? I was so angry at myself. I had to go back to work. It was a year of just unbelievable. A year and a half before Tim died, my oldest son was in a bad car accident, and he lost a 4-year Naval scholarship because of his injuries. 6 months after Tim died, my husband lost his job. And so I had 2 kids in college, so I went back to work. And I worked oncology, and I had wonderful friends, wonderful friends. What I ended up doing is I went back to God.
Amen.
I went back to my meditation, and I talked to God, and I did what Tim wanted done, and that was setting up a foundation in his honor, and to help people with cancer, and to provide scholarships for people and kids in speech and debate. He laid that out at Johns Hopkins. He said, "This is what I want to do with the money." So I put my energy there, but I had to go beneath the surface. I read this poem several times. I had to go beneath the surface to find myself. And I did, but I wasn't the same person. But I was just as good, and I had just as much value, and I had God back in my life. And so when I look at that, I carry my prayer cards in my purse. It's somewhere around here. There are prayer cards in my purse. If I don't go to Mass, I turn on the TV, and you know, pray in front of the TV. And guess what? I am a daffodil. I am a daffodil, and I still bend, but I'll never break. I'll never break, and God did hear me. But what I didn't understand is He wasn't going to pick me up. I had to do it myself. And so what I want you to do is, in your darkest hour, look beneath the surface, because you are there, and you will find yourself. Again, it's not going to be the same person, but it's going to be a person of value and a person of purpose and somebody who can really, really give back to the community and to God's earth. So what I want to share with you, this is a mild poem of what Tim wrote for 2 years. Some of his poetry is so dark, and just it's hard. I will get it published someday. That's my goal, but it's so dark. But he wrote a poem, his last poem before we went to Baltimore. It's called "Running One Night," and I want you can read it at your leisure. But it's running one night, and he liked to run, but Tim liked to run at sunset because he saw the beauty in the sky at sunset. He loved that, so he would run. And he even ran through his first chemo. And Joe knows I'm very generous to Greensburg-Salem because Tim would have chemo on Friday night, and he was going to and very sick. And Saturday morning, I would take him over to Greensburg-Salem High School. Even though he went to Central Catholic, they had to get the bus there. And as a mother, knowing that he was sick the night before, he got on that bus, and there was one Greensburg-Salem teacher that looked at me and she said, "I'll take care of him." And he won awards and everything through his chemotherapy. So when I think of Greensburg-Salem, even though it's my alma mater, I'm very generous with their speech and debate team and their forensics team, because I'm giving back what they gave to me. So what I want you to do is read Running One Night, because there's a phrase in there that is the mission of the Tlc Foundation. And it is, "The land is yours when you look up, when you falter, look up for hope. When you succeed, extend your hand to others." And he was 16 when he wrote that. And it's almost a 4-page poem. I'm not on the battlefield, and I'm thinking, how can I even relate to you people? How can I do this, to do that? And one of the most inspirational people in my life was my grandmother. You know, just her fortitude and her spirit, and you know, the daffodil story just stuck with me. And so I still think of the people at the Ronald McDonald House thinking I was nuts, but I didn't care.
It's seen worse.
Yeah. So God made me a daffodil, and He did. But I lifted myself up, and you have to work at it. It's tough, because you know what? You fall back down. So you just have to kind of pick yourself back up.
You have made all of us feel very humble.
Wow. Amen.